Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am honored to have back Dr. Laurence Heller. Laurence, welcome back to the podcast.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
So Laurence Heller holds a doctorate in clinical psychology. He was in private practice for 40 years. He developed the NeuroAffective Relational Model, or NARM. His book, Healing Developmental Trauma, has been published in 14 languages, and his model is taught throughout the world. He's a founder director of the NARM Training Institute and teaches regularly in the US and Europe. His new book, written with Brad Kammer, previous guest on this podcast, is titled The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, using the NeuroAffective Relational Model to address adverse childhood experiences and resolve complex trauma. Dr. Heller, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to be here.
You're welcome. So before we get going here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Well, I was born in Denver, Colorado, third generation on one side, so I have deep roots there in Colorado. But I've been living for the last 20 years in Los Angeles, which I enjoy too. And as you mentioned, for a big part of my the last 20 years, I've been traveling like 4 times a year back and forth to Europe. So I also feel very at home in Europe. So I'm kind of all over the place in some ways. But
so. We're gonna talk about your book today, but before we do, I want to just, if we can, give our listeners kind of a thumbnail sketch of how did you get into this field in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Well, it was curiosity. It was obviously, like I think a lot of therapists, it was curiosity about what made me tick, curiosity about what made other people tick, just really a deep desire to understand the depths of human experience, realizing that there's much more than the kind of day-to-day, living that, I was experiencing, that I saw many other people experiencing. And so I, as soon as I started doing some of my first experiential work in the field of psychotherapy, I was hooked. I mean, I knew that my very first exposure was I saw this guy doing a demonstration in Gestalt therapy. This was many, many years ago. And I was immediately fascinated. And
by what specifically? Gestalt is right?
Yeah. I was fascinated by, he was like, as they did at the time, he was working with this person's dreams. And by just the depth of the experience, that depth drew me. It wasn't so much until late. I mean, it wasn't until later really that I realized it was also looking for depth in myself. It was just more this kind of instinctive interest in depth, about myself, about other people, about human beings in general, and so one thing led to another, and here I am all these years later.
So, right. But I mean, you developed your own model.
Right.
Not everyone does that. How did that come about?
Well, I think it came about from both the successes and the failures that I experienced, for me personally, and then for other people, and then later, even as I got seriously into becoming a clinician, I started to see that there were so many things that were useful and so many things that were exciting, particularly back in the 70s, when there was all this new energy for different ways of trying to work with human beings. It wasn't just the traditional behaviorism or the traditional kind of psychoanalytic work, and there wasn't much else out there. I actually ended up starting the Gestalt Institute of Denver back clear many years ago. And at that time, there was just what I was saying. There was the analytic institutes. There was, there was a little bit of TA. They actually opened up about their institute in Denver about the same time that I co-founded the Gestalt Institute. And then there was this traditional behaviorism, which Skinner and not what we're talking about today, but the real old-fashioned behaviorism that we had at the at the time, and that still is used in certain contexts for But so that's kind of the sequence.
And what about trauma? Your introduction to trauma, how did that come into play here?
Well, I was working with it before we used the word, and we have to remember how much this word has shifted and how it really didn't exist in the way that we use it now, even 50 years ago. So trauma, if you said trauma, particularly to a physician, they were always thinking medical or physical trauma. And then we, of course, with Vietnam War, and we started to, begin to understand what was traditionally called shell shock, or there were different words, but they started calling it, PTSD. That became a diagnosis again I'm conflating what had took place over many years. And so the word trauma at that point was specifically being used for what I differentiate now as shock trauma versus developmental trauma. Shock trauma being more single incident kinds of trauma, or not related specifically to the family, to relational trauma, to developmental trauma. And so I was very involved in working with PTSD for a number of years, but I saw that the models for PTSD that were developing and that were out there really didn't deal with the more emotional and developmental kind of trauma that I had already been working with, but we didn't use the name trauma at the time. So I began, and I had been doing that work even consistently from the very beginning of my career, of addressing what we're now calling trauma, but then started to understand more of the role of the body and the nervous system and other elements through some of my exposure to different shock trauma methods. And I just felt that there was a big gap between shock trauma and working, with the self-regulation models that were developing and that I was a part of myself in the earlier years, and what we needed to address in terms of human development and what we now call complex PTSD or developmental trauma. And there were other tools that were needed. People were actually being missed. And then I also saw an experience, because I tried many different things in a serious way, not just dabbling. I experienced that other techniques, like there was a lot, and I consider myself psychoanalytically and psychodynamically informed, but there was a lot that was being missed in that process, particularly in the early years, the relationship of the body in all of this. There was very little talk about the body, except maybe in terms of conversion reactions or, the languaging that we used at the time, but not realizing what I talk about in NARM as the functional unity between the psychological and the physiological. And that seemed to me to be an important distinction. There were some elements of that in the body-oriented psychotherapies that I was exposed to in the 70s, right? Different kinds of Reichian traditions and bioenergetics, and many other body works were being developed. I was, very much involved in the early years of Rolfing, not as a Rolfer myself, but as somebody who had their body worked on many times and found that all of this together made a more effective approach to working with people than just focusing on, ideas or beliefs, or just focusing bottom up, trying to regulate nervous systems. That these were useful elements, but they didn't cover the whole spectrum of what we need to address with developmental trauma. And then, of course, in the 90s, we had the ACEs study that came out, and that gave a language and a name for things that many of us as clinicians had already understood, but it created a different awareness in the public over time. It took a little while for it to gain traction. Strange thing, just to mention, because I do spend so much time in Europe, is that the Europeans have not talked very much about ACEs, and are not, and many experienced clinicians are not even aware of it. It's different in different countries depending on where you are, but still, it's such a common reference point for clinicians in the U.S. and not so much yet in Europe, which I found intriguing. But that was all part of the development that that was both personal in terms of my own personal awareness, as well as the work that I was doing with other people. But it was also a general understanding in the field that was developing that there was something else that is needed. Then, with Aline Lapierre back in, it's been about 14 or 15 years ago, together, I had started a book and worked with a professional writer and, was trying to put together a book on developmental trauma. And then never was able to quite get it together in terms of the way I wanted it to be. And then Aline helped me to really finish and round out that book. And the interesting thing was that there was in that book that I talked about the importance of how trauma, and then at that point, developmental trauma affects autonomic and emotional regulation, how it affects what we now talk about as self-image, and as we talk about, and it affects a person's capacity for relationship. So years after that, when CPTSD became part of the international, became an official diagnosis internationally, those were the 3 points, the same 3 points that they used to make a distinction between developmental trauma and shock trauma. And so really, and I said too that, I learned from a lot of mistakes. In the 70s, there were a lot of cathartic. The somatic psychotherapies were exciting and thrilling and emotional and dramatic and not always helpful. Sometimes they were, but not always helpful. But I saw that regressive work was often very destructive to many people. And so I started seeing, and I didn't see the need for it. Like the deep breathing and hitting pillows and kicking and all of that didn't seem to help a lot of people in the way that it might have. So I started, in my journey, just kind of picking and choosing what elements that I saw as the most helpful, that we needed to pay attention to the body. My first exposure was to Gestalt, which was and is considered an existential psychotherapy. NARM itself is also existential in that we work in the present moment. And then I saw this really important element that is really a core piece of NARM, which is that how to bridge that gap between what happened in the past to the symptoms that people experience in the present. Now, for some highly integrated people, just becoming aware of what happened in the past helps them change what's going on for them in the present. But that doesn't work for a lot of people. And so what I came to see is that it isn't so much about doing an archaeological expedition into the past. It's not so much what happened to us, but the various adaptations that we made in order to survive, and that develop into what I call in NARM the adaptive survival styles. It's these adaptations that once saved our lives, that now as adults create the symptoms. then I started looking, at even more deeply at this broader theme of psychotherapy. And like, there was Anna Freud and her long list of defense mechanisms, which was very useful and, part of the development of psychoanalytic understanding. But then I started to ask myself, well, what is the common denominator here between all of these so-called defense mechanisms? And then I saw that really what we're talking about here is various aspects of disconnection. When life gets too painful, when emotions get overwhelming, when basic psychobiological needs don't get met, then we use various kinds of strategies and mechanisms to disconnect. And I saw that connection and disconnection was a fundamental theme that I started to address more directly. And actually, the original title of the very first book that I wrote was on shock trauma with Diane Poole-Heller, and then this second book with Aline Lapierre on developmental trauma was seeing that the specifics of how the adaptations that we made, which once saved our lives, now are, as I mentioned a moment ago, creating the symptoms. And what that then led me to see is that when we get goal-oriented, when we're trying to create change for the client, we're almost by definition going to miss them. And that's actually a profound paradigm shift when we really look into that.
Can you give us an example there? Because that's very interesting.
Okay. Well, so for example, many therapies, not just the traditional somatic psychotherapies, but some of the analytic psychodynamic therapies saw, for example, that the client had a lot of anger. They were just dealing with a lot of anger that they weren't aware of, that maybe was coming out in the form of bodily symptoms or depression or anxiety, that it expressed itself in a variety of ways. And so they had this idea, and many still do, that the idea then is to get people into this anger and to feel it and to get it out. It's, again, that idea is a little less popular these days than it once was, and I saw, again, that trying to get people, for example, into their anger was actually dangerous and disrespectful, because people disconnected from their anger or their needs or what their bodies for a reason. And it's more important to explore the so-called resistance. In other words, what's getting in the way of us being healthily connected to our anger and aggression and to our needs and to our bodies, and to explore the obstacles that we have, the learned obstacles that are now in the way of that kind of deeper connection that is the birthright for all of us. And so instead of trying to get somebody to be connected, I shifted it to, let's explore the various ways that a person has disconnected and feels that they need to continue disconnecting. And ultimately, I came to the understanding that so much of what is driving the fear of connection that we all want ultimately in the variety of ways that we experience a connection to ourselves, connection and intimate relationship for some people, for something greater than themselves, is that what's driving all of this is fear. Is that if the idea is that if we give up these so-called defense mechanisms, these adaptive survival style mechanisms, as I call them, that something worse will happen. And what I came to understand is that there's what in NARM I talk about as the core dilemma, where the child will actually give up what's most authentic and most real, most alive in themselves in order to protect the attachment relationship with the parents. And that's an essential aspect of developmental trauma. And as a child, it made sense, of course, to give that up, but we continue in these patterns, foreclosing aspects of ourselves and even ending up hating aspects of ourselves as part of that foreclosure, which is ultimately a way of trying to protect the attachment or love relationship with the parents, even if the parents are long dead. I mean, the fantasy continues. And so I started putting all of these elements together, and step by step, out of that came NARM.
I mean, it's incredible to hear you talk about your process, because it's. I mean, am I hearing you correctly in saying, because it seems to me like a subtle difference? You're talking about the anger. There's this need for some people to get a client to express their anger, but you're saying rather than that, find out what's inhibiting that expression in the first place.
When people are, for example, having symptoms of unintegrated anger, which can be a whole variety of different things, yes, then I'm saying it's more important to explore the fear of the anger, and then when the fear of the anger, which is always coming from a child consciousness place, what I call in NARM child consciousness, unless people have really, acted out, if they have impulse control, then the other issues come into play. But for the most part, what I'm saying is that, as people explore the fear of the anger and the confusion that many people have between anger, the emotion, and anger, the behavior or the behaviors of anger, then what is needed, what is unresolved that the anger is trying to communicate, can come to the surface, be communicated, but not through a cathartic method, not through biting and kicking and screaming and all of the kinds of things that we did in the 70s, but in an embodied, integrated way. At the same time, NARM is both top down and bottom up. So not only just to feel the emotions, but to understand what they have been trying to communicate to the environment, because emotions are basically communications. And that's the way infants and children, even before there's language, communicate needs and distress and other things to their parents. So the capacity to be able to feel and to integrate makes such a huge difference in people's lives, but we're not trying to get them to feel. That's our natural state. We're helping them explore the obstacles in the way to feeling more, to feeling their feelings, to feeling their bodies. And as they do that, they say, I don't need to do that anymore. I can allow myself to feel. I don't have to keep running from myself, because that's really a big part of what the strategy that we've all used in terms of trying to deal or not deal with the various elements of whatever kind of developmental trauma we experienced, is that we then end up running away from ourselves, running away from our bodies, running away from our emotions, running away from intimate relationships. But again, we don't know what it is really, why we're so afraid. And so NARM is part of the exploration in NARM is exploring. And that's the way, the very first pillar in NARM, we call it the contracting pillar, which can be confusing because it's not like we're actually signing a contract, nor are we guaranteeing results, because as psychotherapists, we can't guarantee results. But what we do in NARM is it's very important for the client to communicate what it is, what their intention, what it is that they're most wanting. And the more they're able to communicate what it is they're most wanting on an emotional level, rather than on a behavioral level, the more effective that initial contract is. And then the agreement between the therapist and the client is, I'll be glad, let's say they want to have more capacity for intimate relationship. We can't promise that they're going to end up in an intimate relationship as therapists, but what we can promise is that I'll explore what's getting in the way of you having the capacity that you're wanting for intimate relationships, or whatever it is. I just use that as an example.
So your second book, The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, how did that come about? Why did you write that? Who's it for?
Well, it was written with Brad Kammer, who's my partner at the NARM Training Institute and the director of training there. And we had been creating literally hundreds of webinars over. We've been together, the Institute, now for about 6 years. And we saw that these webinars on a variety of different topics were already the framework of what we thought could be a very useful book, where we could drill down more into the clinical techniques and the clinical understanding in NARM in a way that I didn't have the time or the opportunity to do in the same depth in the first book. The first book presents the developmental model, some overview and some detail about the various survival styles, and then at the end of each chapter on each one of the survival styles, some clinical orientation about how we help these individuals who are dealing with these dynamics move towards resolution. So the book with Brad is really the next step, where the whole focus was on how do we help all of these dynamics and help people move to resolution, whatever that might mean in their individual life, helping them, finish what is unfinished from their history and become aware of the adaptations that they made that they don't, to difficult situations in early life that they don't need to make as adults, that they have to help clients see that they have many more options than they realized when they're viewing the world through a child's eyes, which we all do to a certain degree. And so, in terms of that whole piece of NARM not being regressive, it's my experience that we're all regressed enough. And that, we're all stuck in different degrees, in different ways, in various kinds of developmental dynamics. So there is actually, we deal with what I talk about as child consciousness, but I don't talk about the inner child, because I don't want to make that a thing. That's just a metaphor. It's a construct, a way of understanding. And as as clinicians get further into NARM, they see that in general, I tend to avoid nouns in NARM. So I don't talk about, of course, people will come in, they'll be complaining about burnout, but I will then at some point when the timing is right, I'll say, well, I'll be glad to explore with you how you burned yourself out on your last job, let's say. And so that's beginning to address then the language of agency, which is also a very important piece in NARM in terms of how we've all internalized the environmental failure that we experienced as children, and then carry it forward and repeat it in a variety of different ways and a variety of different strategies as adults. But that was a long-winded answer to your question about who's this for. So we've written it obviously more for clinicians, but just like with the first book, which did very well in far beyond the population of clinicians, where this book is also for people who want more specific information about their own healing, and who are probably have had some experience in different psychotherapies, finding some things that help, some things that didn't work as well. And so it's really for various kinds of clinicians and other helping professionals who want to integrate a NARM-informed, trauma-informed understanding to their work, but also to the general public who are just interested in personal growth and personal development and relieving some of the suffering that they've experienced.
So specifically, we're talking about complex trauma here, right? In the book. Can you give us, as best you can, kind of an example of what a case might look like, how you deal with it in the book, kind of a snippet?
Well, generally people come into the therapeutic process because they're symptomatic. They're feeling, It could be very specific symptoms, or it could be generalized symptoms. It could be anxiety or depression. It could be the breakup of a recent relationship, and they're suffering, in the aftermath of that. So we start with addressing that. What is it that's going on? What is it that's bringing you here? And what would you most want for yourself? That's the first pillar. Like, what is it that they're, and ideally getting something more than just symptom relief. So we'll start with where they are struggling in their lives right now. And then we begin to explore, what the details of that struggle are. And the interesting thing, and what I think distinguishes NARM from other therapies, is that by staying so precisely in that phenomenological here and now, kind of addressing their direct experience in the moment, that whatever has been unfinished from the past, instead of having to go look for it, it spontaneously emerges. Seriously, I mean, you have to see this, and I've seen it hundreds of times now, to see how spontaneous that is. But let's put it this way. We're constantly working with this connection-disconnection dynamic in the here and now with clients. And we're just reflecting to them both when they're more connected and when they disconnect. And so there's a growing mindfulness or somatic mindfulness or increasing awareness of this connection-disconnection process. As soon as people start to become more aware of that, and start to feel more connected, then what they've been disconnecting from tends to surface. And that tends to be often certain childhood memories or childhood experiences. The other thing that I think is important to remember about this general field of complex trauma is that we're not generally talking about specific incidents, although there may be some that are very important to address. But in general, what characterizes complex trauma is the chronicity of the process, that it's often, when we're talking about neglect, abuse, chronic misattunement, we're talking about dynamics that take place over years and years and years. And so there's this chronicity piece. It's not like being hit by a car, which is a single incident shock trauma, as terrible as it is. It's different. And there's another piece, which is that it tends to be relational, and the R in NARM stands for relational. It tends to be relational in the fact that often the perpetrators were members of the family, immediate or extended, often the parents or step-parents. So, and this relational piece brings up the whole conflict that comes up for children, that to be angry at the person upon whom they're 100% dependent and with whom they have a love relationship, it's hard to feel the protest, the anger, and even the rage that comes up when you've been mistreated or abused or neglected in some significant ways. And that dynamic doesn't automatically come up in shock trauma. So it's one of the important distinctions that is important for all of us as clinicians to understand.
Wow. As we kind of wind down here, so I'm assuming the best way for people to get in touch with you is your website.
There's the NARM Training Institute website, which is the major website. I have my own website, which is more oriented towards the European teaching, but people can, for the general U.S. and all of the online stuff, that's on the NARM Training Institute website. Yes. Okay.
My guess is people are going to be listening to this, and just the way you're able to articulate how NARM addresses relational trauma is fascinating. My guess is people are going to want to learn how they can learn about NARM. So I'm looking at your website now. You have trainings, you have seminars. These seminars listed all over Europe. My gosh.
Yeah, we do.
So do you have online things people can access?
Yeah, we
in
have.
person?
Yeah, we actually, it's only in the last number of months that we've gotten more back into in-person trainings. We started off like 90 some percent in person. And then, of course, COVID came. And like so many other people, we had to adapt. And so then at this point, we've still got a significant presence online. We've got this subscription program where people can get webinars and see demos, and they have regular access, and new material is coming on every month.
Okay.
So there's that, and that's called the Inner Circle training. I may have misstated, but then we've also got an online training program for people who are not licensed psychotherapists. So we call that our OBT, or Online Basics Training. That's open to all helping professionals who want just more NARM-based, trauma-informed understanding for their own work, whatever that might be. So there's all different helping professionals are welcome in that. And then we've got our what we call our level 2, which is for licensed psychotherapists. And there they get significant exposure to the basic techniques and an overall understanding in NARM. Then we've got a third year, which has to do with working with what is traditionally described as personality disorders. And then I teach this kind of ongoing webinar, this is online, called the Postmasters, where for those people, and we get a lot of people who want to stay with this through the process, who can really want to take the time to go into a great deal of depth about the more difficult areas of human experience. And I call that fourth year training the primitive edge of experience, because I'm really helping people learn how to work with very complex PTSD, work with personality disorders and other kinds of major sources of trauma.
We'll have everything linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Dr. Heller's book, again, is called The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma, Using the NeuroAffective Relational Model to Address Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resolve Complex Trauma. And Dr. Heller, I'm assuming that can be purchased anywhere.
Yeah.
We'll have it linked up here again.
Yeah.
Dr. Heller, it's been a while since we talked initially, but man, you're amazing. I mean, you're so, you can feel your experience and the depth of your experience, and your ability to articulate the work you do is really super inspiring. So anytime you want to come back here, you're welcome.
Okay. I'd love to.
Take care.
Okay, good.